Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. I'm Alistair Chariton, your host this week. Our main topic is navigating ESG and supply chain risks by building resilient and responsible networks. And first of all, I will introduce my guests and we'll discuss a topical news item. As always, there's a chat panel which you can open up on the screen and join in the debate. And your comments are always welcome. We'll try and answer as many questions and comments as we can. And I know the audience always appreciate them. And meanwhile, it's a reminder that, as always, we will be awarding a Supply Chain Talk mug, if I can get it to appear with the clever camera, to the comment or question that we find the most useful for the debate. So please do participate. Let me introduce my three guests. The first of these is Daria Kitsenko. She's Program Manager Operations at SL Group, a manufacturer of bicycles, bicycle parts and accessories, and she's based in Groningen in the Netherlands. Daria is a passionate supply chain and procurement professional, and as well as working for a bicycle manufacturer, she enjoys exploring the world of cycling and outdoor sports, but all to keep up with her 9-year-old. So welcome, Daria. Our second guest is a familiar figure on the show, Professor Mamoon Habib, and he is professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh and also at the University of Texas. And he's professor at the School of Business and Entrepreneurship there and a visiting scientist at the University of Texas. And he's also an adjunct professor at Unirazak in Malaysia. And his main specialization is supply chain management, and he's also involved in training, workshops, consultancy, and industry-based research. So welcome back, Mamoon. And finally, we have Tatiana Pagota Yoshida, and she's Innovation and Technology Coordinator for Grupo Energia, based in Sao Paulo. Tatiana is a sustainability expert turned innovation leader, bridging ESG and technology to drive business transformation. And away from work, she's a drone pilot and an enthusiast of specialty coffee, combining her passion for technology with a love for exploring global flavors. So welcome, Tatiana. So our news item is related to ESG. It's from the website Responsible Investor, and it's just their weekly roundup last week of a number of stories, but there's two particularly interesting ones. The first sort of lead item in their roundup is about BNP Paribas Asset Management and Mercury Investment Services among the investors basically calling for investor action on PepsiCo to report regarding human rights and labor in India's sugar production. So PepsiCo, gets sugar from India, among many other countries and sources. PepsiCo are responding to say, well, it's less than 5% of their total operations, and therefore they don't have to report about it because that's the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission guidelines. One could argue that for a company of the scale of PepsiCo, even a few percent of their operations is a lot of people, a lot of sourcing, and it's not really much of an excuse. But let's debate that in a moment. And the second story, the second main piece in this roundup is about one of the UK pension providers called the People's Pension, and they pooled £28 billion, which is currently under management with State Street Global Advisors, the US fund manager, and they are reallocating that to the investment management companies Amundi and Invesco. And this is seen as a major rebuke to the US manager over its pullback from climate stewardship. And I think it's just interesting, in terms of that, I mean, talking, money can talk, that if that 28 billion was earning State Street perhaps a 1% annual management fee, that's 280 million pounds of lost revenue for State Street. So a pretty strong rebuke. So Daria, I mean, there's lots in this roundup. Do you think these examples, are absolutely the right direction, or is there a risk that it can mean that companies are having to respond and to all sorts of short-term news stories, even when it's just 1 or 2% of their global turnover, and perhaps there's a risk they could even lose focus on their main ESG strategy. So I don't know what struck you about this roundup.
Well, I think, as any expert would often say, both answers are valid to a certain extent.
Right.
what strikes me here, I think mainly that it shows growing interest from public and from investors towards the supply chain in the context of, well, investment funds, if we talk about the second example. And it shows that whatever the size, no one can avoid, whatever size and whatever the industry, even if you are in the finance industry, no one can avoid looking into the transparency of their supply chain and checking that for the sustainability. Is this way 100% constructive? Maybe not, but I think it's this pendulum for, if you don't have those examples, you don't push the industry forward. If you have them, if you have them continuously, it shows that there are still gaps to address. But perhaps my colleagues can also add something.
I'm sure they will. Professor Habib, what do you reckon on all this?
Thank you. You know, when I noticed these two examples, I just try to recall from the our recent development in the Asian countries, because Asian countries nowadays we are trying to work on the ESG metrics in the different industries. If when you talk about the this kind of PepsiCo and other things, so it is very common that because nowadays they'll try to focus on this ESG metric. Ultimately, their main target to create the social responsible supply chain management. Social responsible supply chain management. So this is their focusing point. And when you have this kind of focusing point, that time you understand that you cannot ignore this kind of small issue because the part of this one. If you look very carefully, like our ESG metrics, there is a social component and the few variables. Like you have to think of the human rights, you have to think of the child labor, healthy and safety issues, gender diversification, and employee engagement and other things. So it's very correlated with our what is in this example social impact. And the second one, what you are talking about, that another example, this is a question of the good governance, ethical practice. So when you come to this kind of ethical practice and good governance, again, they can ignore because you know that even the profit also depends on this kind of social impact, how they have the branding image. So good governance and this kind of ethical practice, compliance add the value to the sustainable development of the organization. That's why, though it is a very small issue, but this kind of issue create the high impact upon the future development of the sustainability of the organization. So I would say that is a very critical discussion, and from the academic point of view, we have to give the support for this kind of initiatives. But again, the question will be there that what our previous Daria mentioned, that the business perspective, they also the another issue. We don't want to talk about that issue, but it is also we have to think and their opinion as well. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. And I think it's interesting actually with State Street, because of course quite a few US organizations are sort of like pulling back from ESG in various ways, partly I think led by what President Trump and his administration are busy saying. And I think it kind of shows, well, if you want to pander to President Trump, it might cost you in other ways. So I think it's an interesting example, the one with State Street. But Tatiana, what struck you about these stories?
Well, I think it's a very complicated issue, especially for PepsiCo. We'll talk more about PepsiCo. Strategy is important to give you a north, the direct efforts and financial efforts too. But they do have human rights commitment. They do have specific targets on human rights commitment, but it's restricted to the first tier and not in India. However, how can you not look into this when it comes to light? I think some kind of response different from that one they gave us should be given. For example, we weren't aware, I don't know, of this issue, but we would reassess the risks in India, and we will reevaluate what is happening right there to see if we can redirect efforts, but not, it's just under 3% of our supply, so it doesn't matter if a child is being exploited and there is like forced labor. So
Yeah.
I think it should, it's not like we can go to the extremes. You have to find a way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Tatiana. Yeah, and it is interesting, that 5% rule, because you could say, well, it's not a rule; it's a kind of a guideline, it's a threshold, and yeah, well, one could argue to say, well, it's realistic and so on, but equally, when you're a certain size of organization, 5% of a huge turnover is still a very huge turnover and a big operation. So that's an interesting debate.
And I would definitely agree with Tatiana that this reaction on these kind of claims is important, because then reaction and actions afterwards can tell a lot about how the company is actually following, is transparent to address things. As we maybe will talk later, it's very resource demanding to do all the research, etc. So it's one of the big trade-offs. But in the end, the reaction can show this approach very much.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say, Daria, with the reaction, because in fact in the article there's a little bit more detail about State Street, responding to losing so much business there, and they don't really say anything. They just say, oh well, we're still growing our portfolio with other clients. They don't really address the point of why have you pulled back from climate stewardship. So it is, as you say, Daria, interesting to see how people respond. Right, so let's move to our main topic, and as a reminder, that's navigating ESG and supply chain risks by building resilient and responsible networks. So our first discussion point is uncovering environmental and social vulnerabilities in sourcing, production, and distribution. So I guess sort of here, and we have discussed it before on the show, is it's very difficult. How do you ensure that you have sufficient visibility of suppliers and partners, especially when they're remote, and especially when you get to second and third tier suppliers? So Daria, you were talking about the effort that can be involved in doing this. What are your thoughts, your advice on how one can do this?
Well, as almost couple of decades working with procurement, one of the first thoughts that came to my mind include that into your sourcing process and think through your sourcing strategy, what kind of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers are going to be involved there, what kind of industries are going to be involved, and evaluate the risk from that point of view. On the other hand, I think COVID taught us a lot, not from ESG perspective necessarily, but overall about the risks and vulnerabilities of having remote supply. So considering the total cost of ownership versus total impact, including ESG, in nearshoring and shorter distances can be also a solution. And third thing is building a long-term partnership. And instead of looking only at the cost when choosing the suppliers, looking at how can you develop a longer-term and more deep relationship with the main suppliers, especially in the key areas, so that it opens the door to the deeper due diligence, more open book policy, and access to that supply chain upstream, where you can overview and assess the risk. But it always will be a trade-off, because you cannot hire an army of people often to do that. Prioritization is key, segmentation is key, and unfortunately, we may even you do all the best effort, you can still face this kind of publicity. But again, as I said before, the question is, how do you address it and how do you react?
It's a really interesting point, there, because there have been examples in the past, I think a few years ago, where companies discovered there was child labor and so on in some of their factories, and you can either just totally shut down that factory, or not shut down the factory, but just totally disengage from it, which has got a lot of damage and so on. And I remember that there have been some examples where companies instead have said, look, this is really important, you can't do that, we're going to pay for you to lay on schools for children, and kind of there might be a little bit of part-time work or whatever, but to actually react and improve rather than just cut and move to a different supplier, which may not solve the problem. So yeah, that long-term partnership and the longer-term view is very important. Professor Habib, kind of what are your views on how you can monitor effectively such complex supply chains these days?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to start a very good example. If you recall that in the last time when the Donald Trump he took the position as the president of the US, during his inauguration, they used the Republican Party, they used the cap and the T-shirt. And that cap and T-shirt were produced in the Vietnam and Bangladesh. Look very careful, very interesting thing. That cap and T-shirt were produced in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Even, it's very interesting thing is that though it produced in Bangladesh, but the level of the of that organization, of the company, they don't know that it will be used in USA during the inauguration of the Donald Trump. And interesting thing is that, in fact, they are not getting this order from the USA, from the Republican Party. They are getting this order from another middleman.
Yeah.
So the same middleman comes from the Hong Kong. So they are giving this order to the Vietnam and Bangladesh. So why they like to choose the Vietnam or Bangladesh? Due to the low labor cost. And unfortunately, if you look very carefully, even USA, the Republican Party, even they don't know what these products will be produced in which factory and where is the country. They know that they will they will receive the product from the Hong Kong directly. And the issue is that the company in the Vietnam, even in Bangladesh, sometimes they are not applying this compliance. So due to as they are not commitment to the compliance, so they are practicing this kind of unethical things like child labor. They have the pregnant woman labor. Even the labor cost will be very low, which is below the standard. So they're also doing this kind of practice because they have no transparency directly to the customer. They have no transparency directly to the supplier. They're working under the umbrella of the middleman. So when you're talking about these kind of things, how we can monitor the second and third tier suppliers, how can we monitor this? And it's very difficult and complex. But nowadays, there's some practice. That's why I said earlier, we called it that a social responsible supply chain management. And we have to make sure the transparent supply chain management. In that case, maybe you can apply the technology-driven supply chain management in order to ensure that flow of information will be visible and transparent. At least Republican Party of USA, they have to know, oh, this product is coming from the Bangladesh or Vietnam. So maybe they like to the cross-check or the reback check, reverse supply chain they like to follow. They like to see whether they got enough payment, whether they are the compliance for this kind of social and the environmental issues. Because if we could do this kind of the transparent supply chain management by applying the technology, that definitely it could add the value to the whole society. And what our Daria mentioned earlier, it is not necessary to say ESG matrix application, but it is also our social commitment. How could ensure this kind of environmental issues, social issues should be maintained? So I believe this is challenging and trade-off between the two group of people, but everybody should be responsible with the whole supply chain. So you have to start to think that it is the responsibility of all stakeholders. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And it's a good point you make that certainly if you start by dealing with a middleman, you straight away lost your first opportunity for visibility. If you're not dealing with anyone directly, you're dealing with a middleman even for your primary supplier. So that's certainly an interesting point. Tatiana, I know you just had a few technical things, so you're back with us. Great. No, not to worry. Yeah, what are your thoughts on how you can uncover and monitor your supply chain networks effectively?
Well, sorry if I repeat something Dara said because I missed her. Well, I think technology plays an important part in giving supply chain transparency and contributing for us to monitor the risks. However, we should consider that the majority of the smallholders aren't even included in the digital world. So at least in Brazil, in the Northeast, in the North, there is this digital inclusion gap that we must face in order to gather data, because the transparency, what is transparency? Is data becoming information about the supply chain. How do you collect data from smallholders in remote areas? This is a challenge that should be addressed, and I believe acting locally with like local institutions or organizations, we should address this properly, because they will work on digital inclusion. They will train the smallholders, the small producers, and these traditional populations to use technology and gather data for the transparency that we need to address risk, social environmental risks. So I've been in the field for many years, monitoring various supply chains, and the digital inclusion is a gap that we face in Brazil, and I believe in many countries. So this should be addressed, and connection too, because solutions must operate offline for them to go somewhere they can be online and transfer the data. So it's quite a challenge, but it's possible to address that. Education, providing means for them to collect data, it would be imperative for us to monitor the third and the other tiers in the supply chain.
That's a really interesting point, because of course, there are quite a few solutions out there, always cloud-based, web-based, and so on, claiming good functionality, but actually, as you say, a lot of the suppliers, when you get to second tier, third tier, beyond, they may be remote, they may not be kind of with fantastic internet, as we all find ourselves, even in the middle of a city, you can still have poor internet, and goodness knows what it's like further afield. So it's a very it's just a practical point, but it is a very good point there. Thank you. Let's move to our second point, which is strategies for proactive risk management and compliance with evolving ESG standards. So I guess the news item showed how investors and activists, in the case of PepsiCo, can take action on a very specific single issue. So in terms of kind of when you're trying to do risk management, I mean, how do you balance that? Because you could have hundreds and hundreds of risks that you're trying to balance, or you can, and then it can become difficult, or you could be more general, and then there's a risk that there'll be a specific issue which you haven't kind of prepared for. So Daria, what are your thoughts on how specific you need to be, and how do you get that balance of good, effective risk management?
Look, I think, as well as with risk management in any other area, it's good to start with mapping and, well, segmentation, what I mentioned before, but in another scale over here, in terms of likelihood and the severity of impact on your business. And I think that it shouldn't only be sitting within supply chain. It should be kind of an overall assessment for the business, depending on the industry you're working with, how fairly regulated it is. If you produce baby formula, there is one set of things you need to think about. If you produce bicycles, it's another set of things. So this is really important to put your industry hat on and get this assessment together. And as I mentioned before, look at your supply chain, at least industry-wise, to upstream as much as possible and see what kind of things can be happening. Because, for example, for us in a cycling industry, aluminium production is it's basically tier 4, most probably at the very least, and we don't meet these people. We are very small for those people. That's also a big challenge as well. But at least to start understanding what kind of issues may be faced there, and test at the earliest point that you can is test and assess is a good tool to implement. Another one I wanted to mention is something that one of my line managers told me at the very beginning of the career, which basically means to keep your eyes open. He told me, Daria, nothing stops you of going to the websites of your suppliers, or also just search for the news in the area or in that industry and see what kind of things people mention about the company. And now I think we can even utilize, I don't know, ChatGPT or other AI tools to say, okay, your supplier is located in India, go to Indian resources, check what are the what are the mentions about or trends overall. And I think it can be quite insightful on the, let's say, transactional buyer basis, or to kind of get to that understanding of where we are. And the last but not least, what Tatiana also mentioned, engage with local community. You cannot, with all the technology and all the mapping, you cannot distract the points that people see in their daily life. So that's something which is really important.
Yeah, lots of great advice there, Daria. Thank you. And I think it's an interesting point you make, that it's, when you're not a global organization like PepsiCo, kind of, what influence are you going to have with a major aluminium producer on the other side of the world? I mean, realistically, you can't have any influence. So it's very difficult to kind of what you can rely on there. But as you say, there's a lot of research you can do these
You can
days.
only switch, so that's your influence. But that, again, to be able to do that, it's the knowledge is something that is where it starts.
Yeah. No, thank you. Professor Habib, what are your thoughts on how to risk manage effectively?
Thank you. As we are talking about this one, like the proactive risk management and compliance. So when you talk about the proactiveness, then this is a very this is a very critical issue to think how we can mitigate this kind of risk within the ESG metrics or ESG standards. As we know that if you think they're like ESG, environmental, our main issue is to implement the sustainable practices, such as the reducing the emissions, conserving the resources, and investing the renewable energy. If you come to the social, you already mentioned foster a diversify and inclusive workplace, engage with communities, and ensure the ethical supply chain practices. And when you come to the governance, then we have to think of the maintain high standards of corporate governance, including the transparent accounting practices and effective board oversight. Now, come to the question is that you have a risk. How can you manage this kind of risk within the three standards? We can apply that. I think is very popular in the industry, 4 T's. First of all, the tolerate, terminate, treat, and then transfer. So I think you are very familiar with this one. So tolerate, if you notice the risk has a low likelihood and impact, it may be acceptable, but if should be lagged or monitored. So it means that we have to accept it, but we have to think in the accountability, monitor whether it could be extended the risk for the future. Second, on the terminate, if the risk is far beyond your company's appetite for risk, or if it could be severely important in your business, these activities should be terminated. So now our target is the terminate, the second one.
Yes.
The next one, the third one, the treat. The third one, you will almost certainly decide to take action to mitigate the most severe risk. So what I said that we have to understand which one the most severe risk. This might include taking steps to reduce the likelihood of the risk occurring or the severity of the consequences if it does. Finally, the transfer. We can opt to transfer risk to third parties. For example, like through insurance issue. It is a very critical issue as well. Well, risk transfer incurs the cost. It helps reduce or eliminate the potential impact of the risk. Now, come to the question is that how we can start these kind of things to apply in your organization. But your ultimate target, proactiveness, risk management, and compliance with the ESG standards. So it depends on the top management how they can respond to this kind of risk. Thank you.
No, thank you. I like that model. It's very clear and simple. I guess, Tatiana, I mean, I think what's interesting with what Professor Habib was saying there is that things like transferring risk, getting insurance against it, you can do that for things like a warehouse burning down. But, when it's when it's ESG risk, it's the reputation, and it doesn't matter what insurance you've got, the damage is done. So it's a very interesting, you know, kind of challenge there, isn't it? But what are your thoughts on risk management?
Well, I joined the professor and Daria on their comments, and indeed, you can transfer social risk to another entity or company. It's impossible. So just you need to deal with that. But to deal with that, you need to map everything, map the risks, and then prioritize, as I said. You need to direct efforts. You need to see what kind of risk is more impactful, what is reputational. You need to take into consideration the industry, the sector you're in, because risks depend a lot between types of businesses and the regulatory framework, the country, and even cultural aspects, because reputation is very linked to culture. So map and then prioritize, and then there is AI nowadays for you to monitor this kind of thing. AI can monitor different types of data, image, satellite imagery, aerial surveys, and media. So you can come up with a solution to monitor everything with little effort. Of course, a little investment in the beginning to come up with this model. But nowadays it's easy to monitor risks and to see and try to forecast their impacts if they happen, if they become a real impact. So the question, how specific it can go, it depends a lot on the context and the sector. But it's nowadays it's possible for you to monitor everything through AI and combining different types of data. So then you have to adjust this mapping to your reality, including financial reality, because it takes lots of financial effort to address the risks too.
Yeah, and it's a good point you make about monitoring, you know, and the technology that helps with that, because I know there are solution providers out there who can just, you know, scrape the net for everything in every language, so you can really even get just local news reports. So yeah, it's not just relying on, you know, for us English speakers, well, all of you are fluent English speakers, but you know, it's for me, I could only look at things in English, but you know, you can rely on an awful lot of automatic translation as well, which can help. And I suppose the other thing as well, from what we were talking about before, is that if you've just got a good risk plan and you can demonstrate what you've been doing, if the worst happens and an ESG incident does occur, you can at least say, well, look, this supplier had filled out this, you know, compliance, we do monitor, we do this, we do that. So kind of, you know, at least that doesn't absolve you totally, but it can certainly, I guess, help the messaging and show that you're being a responsible organization. So let's move to our final discussion point, which is building transparent, sustainable supply chains that align with stakeholder values. And we sort of touched, I think earlier, Daria, you were sort of touching on sourcing and procurement teams, and I think, as we recognise, they're essential to building your supplier network. They're typically how you identify your suppliers. But you know, of course, in the past, certainly sourcing and procurement was very much targeted on costs rather than ESG. And it used to be the case that to say, hey, I can buy this product or this component for $10, but equally I could buy it for $15, but from a much more reputable supplier, kind of the decision might well be, no, go for the cheap one. So I guess, yeah, it does raise the question, how do you ensure that objectives are aligned across the business? You know, sourcing, ESG, finance have all got perhaps slightly different objectives. And how do you think that gets dealt with?
Well, maybe it's a very harsh statement, but just let's stop measuring procurement only on cost savings, and that's a leadership decision on the organizational level. I think, because at least in my community of procurement professional, anybody you speak with do not want to be only measured on savings, because they see the entire end-to-end supply chain there, and they see how they can impact the security of supply, how they can impact the sustainability of supply, not not from point of view of sustainable sourcing as we are discussing here, but in terms of no disruptions, stable quality, etc. And ESG is a big part of this. So I think this is really a question to the top management of the organization to align goals and communicate it clearly to everybody. And there will be tough trade-offs, yes, because there will be a $10 versus $15, but sometimes it will be not as obvious. And for me, the question should be more, how do you staff and train those procurement teams to make sure that they know where to look, they know what questions to ask, they have tools to audit, and they have enough resource to do that. In my practice, I did see solutions where luckily didn't lead to any ESG related or any safety related issues actually happening, but where companies were not properly assessed because there was no budget to travel, or because we didn't go through the full, full assessment that SGS could do. We only did the basic. And that's something that I think is, for me, would be a bigger issue to address and to find the right space of resource for those risks to be addressed.
Yeah. Okay. There's lots of great advice there. Thank you, Professor Habib. How do you think we should go about making sure stakeholder objectives are aligned?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before going to these issues, if we ask ourselves how we are defining our stakeholder. So this is a very interesting thing, is that suppose I hear our both speakers, they are for different country. So when they are the top management, they have to think who will be our stakeholders. So we have to define this very carefully. Because the question is that transparent, the data visibility, data transparency, security issues. I talk this issue later on. But so first of all, I like to study this way. When you talk about the whole supply chain, there is a different way you have to think. They're like upstream stakeholders, like our suppliers. The focal company, like the shareholder, top leadership, management, employees. Downstream stakeholders, like customers, end users, retailer. Market stakeholders like financial intermediaries, unions, competitor, industry association. Societal stakeholders like NGO, university, like communities, local communities like media, and government entities. We cannot ignore the government entities as well. It's also part of this one. And even the stakeholder without any specification means we have to think about the whole entities, like everybody within this chain. And now come to the question. Now you like to produce that, develop the sustainable, transparent supply chain. The question will be there, how we could manage all stakeholders. This information, flow of information will be the transparent to everyone. So in that case, our best option is that we can apply that technological advancement. We have to think about the artificial intelligence. And I would request that top management, particularly the industry, we should think about the big data. So that means we have to preserve all information data, and then we can use it for the future references to come up with a decision. And then definitely the data security is a very vital issue. So in that case, we can apply that blockchain. So blockchain will help us to come up with this data security. So these entities, that entities, this stakeholder, that stakeholder, no need all information. If they're responsible for the inventory side, they can think of the inventory information. They're involved in the procurement side, they have to respond for procurement side. So how we can divide this information? We can apply the blockchain. We can apply IoT, Internet of Things. So that means our ultimate target, how we can apply the technology advancement. And say our Tatiana or Daria, they are the CEO. So they have to know all information. So they have the one username password they can apply. But the procurement manager, he has to know the one information he like to share with his stakeholders. So he can use this information will not be distorted, and the security will be there. And by this way, you can produce that transparent, sustainable supply chain aligned with all stakeholders' values.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Tatiana, what are your thoughts on how you align stakeholder values when you're building your supply chains?
I think I will go one step behind Daria and the professor, because I think when ESG and sustainability is really embedded in the strategy, the whole organization is built up to address this topics. So it's in all areas have targets, goals, and let's say objectives linked to sustainability or ESG. From my experience, when these two topics are not strategic, they won't be addressed by the other areas, no matter what happens. So I think the most successful cases are common targets and goals that are distributed among the areas, no matter which area. So for example, for me, legal and procurement are critical areas to build a resilient supply chain. You can't do that without these two areas. And there are ways for you to prepare those areas in terms of contract or supplier assessment, qualification, what we call, to address these issues even before the supplier becomes a real supplier. So there is technology, there are softwares, there are companies that do that quite well. So, but again, as Daria said, you just can't look at the price cost reduction. So the whole company should look for the ESG sustainability objectives as a whole. So this is what I've been experiencing these years. So if procurement and legal is not involved in sustainability strategy, there is no point in addressing these issues.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Absolutely. And I think finally, I mean, I think, you know, when we talk about, we all recognize that just driving costs down is probably the worst way to build an ESG compliant network. And I think, you know, the consumer is increasingly aware of that. And there, you know, I think, yeah, there is some, well, there's a balance, isn't there? The low cost providers, low cost fashion, you know, can still be doing well. But I think more and more people, the general public, are becoming much more aware of, you know, the implications of if they buy cheap, it may not be a very high quality supply chain. So let's hope those trends will continue. Great. Well, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. It's been a really interesting one. It's certainly not an issue that's going to go away, and I think we've got lots of insights from the three of you. So our next episode of Supply Chain Talk is in 2 weeks' time on 19th of March, Wednesday the 19th of March at 4 p.m. UK time, with Anna Maria Velika hosting. And the subject there is whistleblowing in supply chain transparency. So that's certainly going to be an interesting one, because whistleblowing, I guess, is one of the ways to uncover problems in ESG, among other things. So so do join us then. Let me say again, thank you to the three of you, Daria Kitsenko, Program Manager for Operations at SL Group, Professor Mamoun Habib, Professor from the Independent University of Bangladesh and the University of Texas, and finally, Tatiana Pagota Yoshida, who is Innovation and Technology Coordinator at Grupo Energia. So thank you, all three of you. Thank you to our audience, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
thank you.